In this video, I'm introducing you to Saturn through the lens of astronomy and mythology. Because very often what happens in astrology is that Saturn gets reduced to being about limitations and restrictions and hard work, but there's just so much more to him than that. I will even argue that Saturn might be one of those planets in a birth chart that can be the most difficult to truly understand and unfold the gifts from, because they are given so much focus on the difficulties as well. And through my introduction here, I think you will gain a new perspective of being able to see all the complexities as well, and the symbolic language in which we can draw from in order to make a more rounded interpretation of Saturn in a birth chart. And there's also, if you're into Saturn in astrology, there's a wonderful book, quite a classic, from Liz Green that is called A New Look at an Old Devil. And I can really recommend you to read that book as well. But for now, let's stay with the mythology and astronomy and weave them a bit together with astrology. And of course, remember to like and subscribe to this channel and enjoy. I think there's so much complexity connected to Saturn and understanding Saturn in astrology, because he is one of those planets that we connect with boundaries and restrictions and time and hardship and work for it and be only rewarded if you follow the rules kind of thing. And then at the same time, it goes so much deeper. So I want to take you through a bit of astronomy and then mythology after, so that we can weave together a broader understanding of the role that Saturn play based on traditional astrology, but then also bringing it back home to our contemporary lens of astrology today. So first and foremost, Saturn is the second largest planet in our solar system after Jupiter. So he plays quite a big role in that sense in itself, and he is the sixth planet from our sun. And Saturn is considered to be one of the classical planets, which basically just means that people have been able to observe him with the naked eye since ancient times. And I think for that exact reason, it's quite important when we talk about astrology to understand that he was known to ancient astrologers as well, but he was known as being the planet furthest away. And therefore, he was sort of also representing the boundary that we know to be our solar system or planetary system. And Saturn in itself is a very slow-moving planet. He takes around 29.5 years to orbit the sun. And that basically means that he spends approximately 2.5 years in each zodiac sign. And I think in many ways that's where you can see that he gets his reputation from, because, we have the Saturn return in our life when we are around 29, then later on at 58 and so forth. And that's when he have been traveling around the zodiac sign and then return to approximately the same position that he was in at the time that you were born. And that is symbolically holding a great deal for us as humans and our level of maturity, because it is as if Saturn, after this long distant travel throughout the zodiac signs, is coming back to ask you and hold you accountable for whether you have matured and learned from the life lesson that has been unfolding from the beginning of his journey. So I think we can also very safely say from knowing this that Saturn then is connected to everything that takes time, long processes and just in general different stages of maturation throughout our human experience. But then there is another fascinating thing, which is when I think of Saturn, the first thing that I see in my vision are the beautiful rings that surround him, and that is probably the most recognizable feature of him. But the ancient astrologers could not see Saturn's rings because they are not observable before we got the telescope in the 17th century. So I think that when we think about Galileo and that he was observing Saturn in a telescope in 1610, that was a turning point for perhaps a way of viewing his impact on a personal birth chart. I'm so eager to emphasize the split throughout history because astrology is such an ancient tradition and art form, but we also have to constantly upgrade it from a contemporary lens. So there's definitely a switch between understanding Saturn from very traditional ancient text to understanding Saturn after 1610, where it got recognized that he had these beautiful rings around him. Because usually what you would hear is that the rings around Saturn represents boundaries, but that could not be the historical reason for that, so that's another layer to it. And I find it quite fascinating too that humans were developing technology to see Saturn more clearly, and then we would discover that he was surrounded by these enormous ring systems, and that ring in itself create a boundary, but that boundary is also not solid because the rings are not known to be permanent, because Saturn is a gas planet, and these rings are actually very thin and in some ways fragile to the extent that they do not last forever. They are not solid rings. And I think when we go in even deeper into it, these rings are made of a big amount of particles, which, for what we know in science right now, is that it's sort of like ice with some rocky material in it, and then they are orbiting Saturn and organized into two different rings with gaps between them. And it's like, it almost looks like a structure, but at the same time it's a mini ecosystem. And that makes me think of all the cells that we have ourselves in our own physical body that needs to collaborate and then creates the boundaries for our physicality, but are not really a solid boundary. I know this is a bit esoteric, but I just want to create that layer to it as well. And then, having that in mind, let's go back to the mythology of Saturn, because obviously Saturn got his name through Roman mythology, which were part of the ancient culture. So there was an understanding of these boundaries before we knew that Saturn had some rings on him. So Saturn was an ancient Roman god, and he was particularly connected to agriculture, but also to wealth and abundance and generation, and also periodic renewal and liberation, which would make a lot of sense connecting it to agriculture, where there's a certain level of work that goes into it and a time where things have to grow, and then you can make a harvest based on what you planted. And I think this is important because Saturn very often gets reduced in astrology to restriction and hardship and discipline and basically everything that is difficult. But there is a harvest in the process too, and there is a enjoyment of the journey while things have to grow on the field as well. And if we go back and take a look at the Roman god, I think this symbolism becomes just much broader than that, because Saturn's connection with agriculture is just particularly interesting. It's almost as if it's this reminder of cycles and fruits for our labor, but it is repetitive as well, because once there has been a harvest, we need to prepare the ground once again if we want to have a harvest next year. So you plant something, there's a period of growth and cultivation and all of that, and then there is a harvest. And these cycles are so connected to how we can later talk about working with planetary obstacles through the knowledge of Saturn, how he can be strengthened, how he can be enjoyed, how he can be understood in a birth chart. And yeah, I also want to mention that Saturn was also believed to have ruled during the mythical Golden Age. So in Roman tradition, this was imagined as a time of abundance and peace, and a time where, private property and the earth produced freely without people having to labor for it. So that is something to keep in mind as well, because Saturn is not usually the planet we will go to when we think of abundance today. And it's interesting because it complicates this modern idea that Saturn simply means hard work, right? So the Roman Saturn is connected to abundance as well, as I mentioned earlier, and also with the earlier state in which the ordinary structures of society was not really existing in the same way as we know them today. And that's something we can see clearly in Saturnalia, the Roman festival that is held in Saturn's honor, because throughout this festival there are some of the normal rules and social hierarchies of the Roman society are temporarily loosened or even reversed. So people feasted and they were exchanging gifts, and gambling were allowed, and slaves were given freedoms that usually they would not have. So even the bindings around the feet of Saturn's cult statue were removed during the festival, which I find extremely interesting as well. And so Saturn is just not only connected to structure and restriction, he's also connected to periods of where that structure is being significantly loosened, and perhaps there's even a feast from it. And that makes so much more sense when we remember that Saturn was associated not just with generation, but also with dissolution and renewal as well. And if we want to understand even further where this identification with time and Saturn, where that comes from, we can look to Greek mythology, because here Saturn was actually connected to the god Kronos, and Kronos was one of the Titans, and he was the son of Uranus and Gaia. And according to the story, Uranus imprisoned some of his children, and Gaia eventually turned to them for help, and Kronos was one of them that acted against his father and overthrew him and became a ruler himself. But now Kronos was warned that one of his own children would turn against him eventually with time, which basically made him very fearful of losing his position of power, to an extent where it was said that he started to swallow his own children and all of these more bizarre part of that mythology. And so basically the story is that he cannot stop the process of time. It's impossible, because time always moves forward and generations change, and you have to be flexible and allow that change to take place in a graceful way. And if we bind all of these things together, we have a much more colorful understanding of the symbolism of Saturn, that he holds the symbolism of abundance and wealth. He holds the symbolism of, hard work versus harvest. He holds the symbolism of having boundaries, but then the boundaries in themselves will also change because they are not permanent. And now on top of it, with Kronos, the understanding that time is passing by, generations do change. So when you can make time your friend by acceptance, by not holding on to rigid forms, by not taking desperate measures to not accept time, then wow, now we have a more cultivated and broad understanding of all the layers of Saturn. So that's what I have for you in regards to Saturn in astronomy and mythology. And please remember to like and subscribe to this channel, and I hope to meet you in another video. Bye for now.